Okay, welcome again for the next round of the vCD Roundtable. Thank you for everybody who already subscribed to any of our channels. We have this as a YouTube channel, but also now on all the modern podcast platforms. So if you hit that wonderful subscribe button, that helps us making more of these wonderful sessions. We will still continue to do it anyway because we have so much fun with it. But anyway, it would show us that people care about what we do. Last session, the first episode was talking about NSX-V to T migration, which is still up on the run for service providers. By the way, if you have any questions on any of these topics, feel free to drop them on the YouTube channel, and we try to answer them whenever the time allows us to. For today's session, we picked up actually questions from the YouTube channel, which came in regards to people asking us, like, how do you think about different design options or appliance deployment options, as well as how to do backup and availability. But before we go into it, let's do a quick round of introduction on who is going to join us for today's show. I'm going to kick it off with myself, as I'm already talking. My name is Yves Sanford, vCDX, and working for the Comdivision Group as one of the lead architects around anything cloud. Handing over to Matthias.
Yeah, Matthias, Comdivision as well, playing a lot with Cloud Director and especially APIs and stuff. I'm kicking off to Daniel.
Thank you, Matthias. Daniel Paluzik, part of the Cloud Provider Solutions Architecture team at VMware. Romain?
Thanks. Yeah, Romain Decker, and I'm a technical product manager at VMware, covering usually mainly networking, but happy to join today also. Tobias?
Thanks, Roman. Tobias Baschek, also part of the Comdivision Group, Cloud Solution Architect for vCD or for Cloud Director, but also mainly related to NSX as Romain.
So you guys have to figure out all the networking once we have decided how to deploy the appliances then in the first place. Before we head into the appliance story, maybe it wasn't always an appliance. Danielle, do you remember when did it change from being, I think the first appliance form factor was just for the workload, the database was still external. But I think this was a long-term request from many service providers back in the days. It's like, why don't you just actually ship this like a vCenter server?
Yeah, and this is the second go-around of an appliance. Many years ago, we actually had a Postgres appliance, virtual appliance, even before my time at VMware, where we used that for it was part of the release back in maybe 5X days. I don't recall, but I remember seeing talk of that. But we started shipping the appliance cell in the 9X code, was the first form factor. It was a very basic cell instance, deploy it and add it to your server group. And the requests we started hearing quite often, especially with the growth of Cloud Director, is how do we make it easier for the day zero and day one operations in deploying it and having kind of a stamped architecture. And so we work closely with our engineering team to kind of have this phased approach on how to deploy the cell instances, and continue to scale that out. That was kind of chunk number one. Chunk number two was, how do we provide a backend database for Cloud Director and build that into the appliances? And then chunk three was, how do we provide a automated and a higher availability of that database in the event of a failure on that? And we continue to add to the appliance on every release, and I think the investment really shows from our appliance management inside of Cloud Director to the capabilities that we've added within a Photon build. That's what we're using on the back end. And then when we look at regulated clouds, one of the things I work with a lot of our public sector customers. One of the things that we really wanted to focus on is how do we harden an appliance right out of the box, right? Well, we can't claim that we're going to have regulatory compliance approvals for this industry standard right out of the box. However, one of the things that our engineering team did is they worked with specific providers or entities to say, what are the things you guys see in your regulatory compliance request when you go through a STIG, and do a security scan? And we worked and built a lot of those findings into our appliance form factor. And you can even see within our latest build of 10.2, we have FIPS compliant builds now, along with a lot of just security standards built in right out of the box. And so I think, if we even from a commercial perspective, even if you're not looking at public sector, the beauty of this is your vector and your coverage of that security standards, it's hardened right out of the box to a certain degree. And so, today we can build out a vCD environment, start off with a handful of appliances, provide a highly available database, front end cells, bring your own load balancer, right? And really all we're really worried about is, I know we're jumping into architecture requirements is, the backend NFS mount and, some of the bolt-on services that you may need for extensibility. So, I'm very proud to see where we've actually gone from this binary install to this appliance form factor, and it's made it so much easier for providers. So, and I'll pass it over to you guys. You guys see these installs all the time. I mean, how much time have you spent, before and after? If you want to take a stab at that, Matthias, I mean, what do you think? What have you seen from an install when you did a Linux-based install?
No, the fun is the installation itself is not that complex, at least my opinion. And
yeah.
And even though if you try to automate installation, it's a pretty straightforward process. Well, I like the database part you mentioned. So what I saw one or two times, for example, companies deploying a high available cloud director infrastructure, so multi-cell instance and all the stuff you need, but have a single instance database in the backend. Like, gentlemen, what happened if you lose the database server? Oh, is it really that dependent on the database? No, not really. So what I really love, and what you have already mentioned about the Cloud Director appliance, is the built-in Postgres database and the database replication mechanism, which is built into the appliance, which makes it very easy to have a highly available database infrastructure underneath Cloud Director. So that's what I saw a lot.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that the process of getting from a legacy installable platform, even if it's still running on Microsoft, because that's a use case I had a few weeks ago. Service providers still sitting on a very old vCD version, and finally getting to the point that their customers more and more complained about the Flash UI, which doesn't work anymore, and how to get them over. And as we went through the steps of how do we get the database from SQL Server into Postgres, how do we change it from a standalone installation into an appliance installation, that's a pretty straightforward process, especially when we look at many other cloud management platforms from all different vendors out there. Some of them are really complicated, especially as some of them are currently moving into more like a container form factor. There is not even a migration path in the first place. I just had that with one which comes from one of the three-letter companies, and there are multiple, so we are not hitting one directly with it. But that's.
Let me ask. So, did you say containers are not the future?
No, containers are the future, but if someone actually, and that specific scenario was kind of weird, seeing someone actually is like, yeah, we moved all of the cloud management platform into a container-based platform. And then we saw, Tobias, you were involved in the project. How big was the container? 16 vCPUs?
a single container, 60 vCPUs and 512 gigabyte of RAM, a single container.
So you could really clearly see that they totally got the concept of how containers and everything work, but they didn't have many containers. So it was, but this again, this is I think the beauty of many of these service provider products we have in the VMware space is especially these, even though the appliance made it a lot simpler, but in general, vCD setup was never complicated as long as people were clever enough to follow the documentation, which usually helps, but in this case even more, because all the stuff around how do we, it's again and again, I had that discussion just a few weeks ago. It's like, how do we get the certificate in? It's like, yeah, let's just follow the steps in the documentation. That would just be simple. I mean, we can do it the complicated way, but we could just actually follow these simple steps. And yes, people complain that there is potentially not a web page on how to replace the certificates, for example. But in general, it's like, how often do you do this? I mean, yes, nowadays with the terms going down to 1 year, or in that specific case, that service provider only allowed 90 days. Yeah, but then you need to do it every 90 days. I would actually call Matthias and get a script built for it, and then it's more or less automated. However, a script on certificate. Yes, that's a weird combination. I take that back.
Scripts are done by Fabian. I'm the workflow guy.
Ah, yeah, okay. Plus, it would involve a certificate. It's not necessarily your fortune area in the first place.
That's a different story.
But coming, as we prepared for this call, Daniel, you mentioned something quite important, that with 10.2, VMware decided also to change the sizings of the appliances. A, for what reason, and B, what do we need to, or should providers actually worry about that and change that as well if they do manual, if they do upgrades? Because I think it doesn't do that automatically.
It doesn't, and so starting with 10.2, and wherever you're going to post the link to the documentation URL. Please take a look at this. This is a fairly new page that we engineering worked on adding this with our TPM team on adding documentation that talks about sizing guidelines. So we did actually increase the vCPU count for appliances for production environments. And it's important. One of the things we started seeing from the field is sizing is always, there's math behind it, but it's also a little bit of science and faith in some capacity, right? And we started seeing some performance exhaustion on the backend PostgreSQL, which, the symptoms were slow tasks, task timing out, errors between sync on the appliances. And we actually did publish this in the documentation, things to look out for in the log. So we did increase it to 8 vCPUs on the medium, and for the primary cell, I think we did for if you're running the database instance, it's 16 now, if I recall correctly. And so, and that's on the large form factor. So I think it's just important to point that out, because even if you're upgrading from 10.1 to 10.2, we're not resizing that VM hardware, right? That's something that you have to take care of and be aware of. And you may not see that until you're having overall utilization, right? But it's something to be aware of. Now, if you deploy a new appliance using the latest OVF, it will deploy it with that new form factor. But I think it's important to call out, and it's one thing that we continue to work on to make sure that we're seeing optimal performance from a instance or site, vCD site.
So Daniel, allow me one question, please. So are you implying, because if you deploy Cloud Director appliances, especially the database instances, you can choose between small and large form factor. Are you implying that you should always go with the large form factor anyway?
Well, for production, I don't even think we have a small anymore. I think we have medium and large and extra large. I think we got rid of the small on that.
Yeah,
so however you name it.
So medium, it was really meant for like small, like proof of concept, small environments, right? I need to deploy it in a lab, right? Large and extra large is where we're deploying for production state environments on that. So typically what we want to look at is, we had previously this hard and fast, well, I wouldn't say it was a hard and fast rule, but we had this rule where you would deploy n+1, meaning I would have at least one cell instance for every backend vCenter instance on that, including another one +1 on that. So we removed that guidance within our public documentation because we thought that was a little too much, especially for a commercial service provider. I may have 30, vCenter instances on my backend instance. That means I have to have 31 cells. It's kind of overkill depending on the task and the number of managed VMs. So what we look at is how many users we're going to actually have. What are those hourly and daily operations? And then what is the amount of managed VMs on that? And I think that that's the one thing when we look at architecture sizing guidelines is what are we forecasting for, right? What are we trying to forecast for? So hard and fast now, I always deploy large or extra large for the appliance form factor. And then, we can talk about how many to start with, depending on the size, since typically environments are organically grown over time. But it's always a minimum of 3, obviously, to start off with because of the backend database. So, the big thing that I see now is just focusing on what is the amount of end users we're going to support, number of managed VMs, what do we see as tasks and activities on an hourly and a daily basis? And typically we'll pick between the large and extra large on that, and then kind of stick to that formula while we scale out.
Right, thanks for that, because that is something I see in our own infrastructure. If you go for multi-cell instance with multiple vCenters, and you do an average deployment, let's say 1,400 virtual machines within 36 hours, that's roughly 0.7 VMs per minute. It's not that much or not that many, but you can observe that Cloud Director is somehow getting a bit slow, and it doesn't like the workload because it's a continuous workload and lots of additional tasks involved and backend automation, everything. So that happens if you're not going for the larger appliances.
Yeah.
Thanks for the clarification.
I have a naive question.
Yeah.
The standalone cells are stateless, right? We can say that they are stateless.
The standalone cells, yes, those don't have anything really on them. I mean, they have the config files on them, but they are all the same. It's only the primary which has the active database, and then you have 2 secondaries which keep the read-only, or not a read-only copy, but which keep the replica copy of the database. So in case the primary would fail, 1 secondary would take over, and it would still have another replica. If that then also fails, we have to have another discussion. But because but in general, the I'm not sure how are they called, app cells or something else. So the standalone cells, which are just going to run operations, are pure front-end cells and service cells. However, I had the discussion on a project lately where a provider asked us, like, can't we just actually put the database cells in the backend and just actually put the standalone cells in the front end? And you can do this from a load balancer perspective, but it doesn't tell vCD where to execute any tasks, because still a vCD is a very task-oriented system. So everything you do ends up in a task queue, And then the task scheduler decides which cell is going to do this task. So this does not actually bring your VCD database cells into a position that they are just database cells. They will still process tasks similar to anyone else. So,
yeah.
and
I've had this debate quite a few times where people are like, I want to just segment away my database instances or my appliances away from the internet. But we have two interfaces on an appliance, right? One for the web front end or API calls. Each one is for your database and NFS, right? And it just doesn't work. And, you know, it's also a moot point too. I mean, if I gain access to, you know, theoretically gain access to the one of the appliance only cells, I could route or have accessibility to a database instance, right? Theoretically, right? So while, like Eve said, you could set up your load balancer pool to only serve traffic to appliance only instances, it's going to distribute out all those tasks and events throughout the entire instance.
I was basically asking for two reasons. Like when you do an upgrade and you have a large number of cells, is it worth like just redeploying completely the OVA, like the virtual appliance for the standalone cells instead of like upgrading them in place? Is that kind of like some, can you get some benefits of that? Like irritating some new hardware requirements maybe that are, if you don't read the documentation.
I think it would help you for that one. The point is, if you deploy these standalone appliances, you still need to run through the procedure to import the certificate and everything else. So there are still a few steps you need to do. I'm not sure if in the end you're really faster, but as Daniel said, it's like, especially for those providers which have a large number of vCenter servers and don't necessarily have a bizarre use case like our internal one, which Matthias was describing, where we deploy that many VMs in a short time window. You shouldn't see that many anymore. I know that I think in the UK and a few other places, there are still service providers running around with 15 plus VCD cells because they have that many vCenters. But that's, again, I think that's this historic reason. And historically, as far as I remember, in version 5 or even up until version 8, this was not necessarily really a soft requirement because there was only one process dealing with all the vCenter work, and that ran, and it was decided to run on one cell. So anytime it had to change that, it locked off from one vCenter and actually locked into the other one, which is not very effective. But that was 5 point whatsoever. But this shows again how long these design decisions actually stick in the documentations. And I'm honestly, I'm also still sticking with it often enough in saying it's like, let's just go with it. But this really depends on the use case. If, for example, I have a service provider who says we are going to have 30 vCenters because every customer gets their own vCenter because they will get their own security solution, backup solution, and whatever else, then I would certainly not actually start deploying 31 VCD cells. That just doesn't make any sense. But as we talk about deployments, and I know this is a funny discussion because we have the spread between US and European people. We said that before already. Europe seems to like stretched environments a lot, versus the overall America's approach is like, hey, if my cluster is gone, it's gone. No, I think it's a different approach. But the point is, and I'm kicking off my thesis on how we do this for stretched environments in Europe, and then whoever wants to can actually come up with their thesis on how to do it in a different approach. What I see when we do stretched, and this could be providers for public sector, hospitals, whatever else, where we just need that kind of stretched infrastructure, because at least in my head, I can't stretch the workload domain and at the same point in time say my management domain is only sitting in one data center. So for me, that only leaves me with two options. I either implement something like Site Recovery Manager, which would take quite a bit of time to bring it up on the secondary site, or I have a stretched management cluster. However, in my designs, at least by the point in time I'm leaving the service provider, the management cluster has 50% capacity, so I can run everything in one site. And that's typically what I suggest with them, is like we keep everything in one site so that in case of a disaster, we have a clear situation of failover, or we do something mixed like all vCD runs on site A, all vCenters run on site B. But at any point in time, I have groups which ensure that all of these machines are always together, so that in case I get a split brain or something else, I at least know a current status quo and can decide what has to go where and how to deal with it. But I'm happy to hear other opinions on that one.
Do I?
Looking for you, Daniel.
I don't want to talk about this. I'm stretched. I did want to close, jump back to our previous topic on sizing guidelines. We recently updated, and I'm going to post this, you'll see it in the YouTube and links and everything. We updated our sizing and scale and performance testing, and we've done all of our testing on large appliance form factor. And it has five instances. So 3 for the one primary, 2 standby for the database, and then 2 dedicated appliance cells. That was kind of the prescriptive guidance that we worked with engineering. So I just wanted to close that out.
Okay, but I'm not letting you get away from the stretch discussion now.
Yes, you're not
prepared the whole time for having an escape route out of that one.
So for me, and I know this is definitely a it's region specific. Like so to basically set the groundwork here, a stretch VCD design is fully supported, right? There's been discussions, and I've heard say that basically that you can't do a stretch VCD site. That's categorically untrue. And we've actually done testing, because one of the design decisions we've done in the past, in my time at VMware, is we've gone from single site, dedicated instance, that's my fault domain, or availability zone, stamp that out for each data center on that, to a regional design, meaning that I might have data centers in a locale or region, and I have a single VCD instance that supports that. And we've seen providers deploy that. And we even have solutions like Cloud Director Availability that supports that regional design on that, right? So I think it really, for me, when I look at a stretched VCD design, you have to separate out your management state from your, so I'll put in networking terms. You have your management, your control plane to your data plane, right? Your recovery should always be focused on recovering your data plane without any other impact to availability, right? From your recovery time objectives or your whatever your recovery point objectives are. Then your management should be your second iterative priority, right? To ensure that we can gain access to our portal, right? Which is Cloud Director, to gain access to that. For me, the biggest thing that I see is, and I will say that I'm not, stretch VCD designs is not something that I'm personally, it's just my personal opinion, I'm not a fan of. I like to dedicate, availability zone fault domains on that. But the biggest thing that I would be looking at is, what is my latency or round trip time between 2 sites where I'm stretching within that? And then how am I going to recover in the event of a failure? What you're going to, and that's the biggest thing that we have right now is within a VCD instance, architecture instance, we have 3 appliances that are really hosting our database, right? You have your primary and your 2 standbys, and we're doing replication, backend Postgres replication on that. We can never have an active instance, from a backend database in 2 sites. So you have to make a design decision on where does that primary go? And then do I allow automatic recovery? By default, we do manual, right? With a appliance deployment. Do I allow automatic recovery? And then what is the storage or replication mechanism do I use to ensure that I can recover my services or management cluster from one site to another in the event of a failure on that? So I know that's probably a very broad and ambiguous statement, but you know, for me, it adds a level of complexity, and that might be okay based on your recovery and recovery time objective.
And maybe let me quickly jump in here. When we talk about stretched environments, I think, and that's potentially where we sometimes have a mix-up from the discussion. We typically talk about a stretched environment within a region. So this would be, for example, Frankfurt. I have 2 or 3 data centers within Frankfurt, and each one of them actually is actually interconnected. Between Frankfurt and Munich or Frankfurt and Amsterdam, I would have these as independent vCD instances so that I would actually use availability and everything else in between, so that I get the latency in far below 10 milliseconds. We talk typically about 3-4 milliseconds and stuff like that. This is more stretched across 2 parts of a building or something like that. I would not allow customers anymore to, and I had these requests. I know that I even reviewed at one point in time a vCDX design where someone tried to stretch it, I think, from Germany to Israel or something like that, which was like, this is actually calling out for a hell lot of problems. And they even got the exception from Microsoft for the SQL Server for it, but that's a different story. But I think that's what you say is very important. You need to be very clear what this means from a recovery perspective, and you need to be very, very clear what can go wrong in this scenario, especially from a database, etc. perspective. Like what happens if both sides all of a sudden go up, and both sides believe they are the master of the disaster and everything else, which comes back to the whole design, especially, and that could be, for example, pretty risky. As long as we have vSAN below with witness, that we are pretty secure. But at least what we still see in Europe, there is at least one type of NetApp metro cluster which still doesn't use an external witness, and that for example would be a risky one. But Romain, you were to say something as well, I think.
Yeah, the usual split brain where you have 2 brains trying to act as active. And also one thing that is almost always overlooked at is how you fail back. So it's nice to fail over, but at some point you have to fail back. And if it's not properly designed, you may not even be able to fail back. And just jumping back to the stretch cluster, to be fair, I have seen many of them in the past, even just with vSphere. Most of the time, like 75 or 80% of the time, the companies that had stretch clusters implemented them for disaster recovery and backup. So the wrong use cases. So they never understood exactly the value or what kind of use case a real stretch cluster address. So it's also like some perception to have also about the real use case to have for a stretch cluster.
And that might actually be the difference here in Europe, is because people try to buy into one product which solves several of their problems at the same point in time, instead of understanding that there is a good reason to keep backup and recovery and disaster recovery and a few things separate from each other. Stretched clusters can be a failover scenario for a specific use case, but you still, even if you have a stretched cluster, you still need backup, you still need a full-blown disaster recovery to a secondary site, because as we all know, the number of cyber attacks and all these things massively increase at the moment, and it's just a matter of time. If someone encrypts, and I hope I never actually get involved into a service provider where we need to figure out how to decrypt their vCD cells from something, but in reality, that's something where, for example, Stretch doesn't solve anything, because in that specific scenario, is you have an encrypted system, period. It's like, that's encrypted on both sides. That's like when I did back then, when we had fault tolerance, where people were trying to use vSphere fault tolerance for disaster recovery purposes, which is like, no, if that Windows fails here, it fails here as well. And the only thing is, back then I used a Windows machine and created a blue screen in it in classes to actually show that, because people otherwise didn't get that it is actually, it's the same machine. It's if it fails on one side, it fails on the other side at the same point in time. It's only protecting you from a massive hardware failure.
Yeah, and just to interject there, I think we conflate, and I'm going to make a broad generalization. A lot of people conflate disaster recovery with higher level of availability, right? And it's not the same. You have to treat them completely independently on that, because when we look at a regional or stretch design, wherever we call it, right, we're using some level of synchronous replication on the back end, right, on that. When we look at a true disaster recovery solution, yes, there might be business critical applications that require near zero recovery point objective, right? But it's not the same, and you have to treat it completely independently. I think it's important. The other thing I want to call out too for a regional or stretch design is the importance of the networking too. And when you look at a failover from one site to another, typically, you don't have the same public IPs. I have to do DNS changes or propagation, load balancer changes, right? And all of that has to be taken in consideration when you do that design. And we also have to look at like some kind of global site load balancing mechanism or something that actually handles that type of logic.
In general, I'm totally with you. This is not easy. You need to solve networking, and that's what I meant before. This is something we typically, at least when I look at the European market, very often only within a very small availability zone. So something where I can really stretch everything easily across. And this is more whether it's a ring of data centers within one city or basically 2 data centers just across the street or something like that. That's an area where you can build this, but this is actually getting very complex if you go broad with it. And we see these requests coming in again and again. But actually, we have, as you said, better methodologies to build something like that, like having 2 different regions with 2 different availability zones, and then actually create federation and everything else in between, and then leverage the methodologies within NSX and all the other wonderful tools we have to build the networking for that. But you actually pointed out one other important topic.
No. Before you go to backup, because I know exactly where you're going to heading for. I'm not letting Daniel off the hook because I have one more thing, but it's not about stretch clusters.
Gosh.
So you mentioned so in the basic deployment we have a primary database and 2 secondary or standby database cells, per instance. As we all aware of, we can choose between a manual and an automated failover if the primary fails. What is your recommendation? Stay with manual, or should we go with automated failover for the database?
I'm going to give the typical architect question answer. It depends, right? You know,
Love it.
We intentionally set it by default to manual, and because the reason is to change the modes, you still have to use the API, right? It's not a there's no UI for it right now on that. So, for me, I think you have to be aware of the mechanism, what we're using, which is a Postgres clustering service in the back end within Photon. And you have to be comfortable with, where I'm building out my services cluster to host the vCD cells. Mm-hmm. What is my availability of that underlying infrastructure, right? And how do you want to approach that from a database availability mechanism, right, on that? So, and you may even want to look at, how we actually approach it. So both modes are fully supported on that. I I have a few providers that have changed it to automatic, just to provide a higher level of availability within their vCD environment. If the providers that are not using it, that are in a manual fashion, they're using their monitoring tools to watch the infrastructure in the environment. And in the event that something fails, they'll have to manually intervene, right? But when you look at a typical failure for me is I lost a host, right? And I lost that host and my primary cell or my primary instance failed. So HA is going to kick in, hopefully, right? HA is going to kick in, reboot that virtual machine. And, if everything goes well, we're going to have, the vCD appliance up and running in a few minutes, right? Maybe a consistency check. But in the event that something went wrong, you have a couple minutes of downtime for that primary instance. So I think it's just a matter of what is my SLA I have to adhere to? Because there might be a managed service provider that's providing service to a customer that says, this is my SLA agreement. Even for the management plane, I still have to adhere to 4 nines of availability, for example, right? So it's just something you have to be aware of.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. All right, Yves, now it's you and your backup path.
Yeah, so I've written down already 2 or 3 new topics for some of the next sessions we can cover. The next thing, or one of the questions we had in the, I think on YouTube or on any forum, whatever, was a question in regards to what do we suggest from a backup perspective. And as far as I remember, I think the official documentation says you use the script on the primary host, which is in the backup folder, and that will actually create a dump of the database, the global properties file, the key store, and throw all of that on the NFS data store so that we have it in an accessible place so that each cell can access it, and hopefully then we figure out how to back up our NFS share. That's at least the documented approach. What I typically say, and I'm going to go ahead and just actually to throw out my story completely, what I typically suggest to service providers on top of that is still do a VM-based backup. Because in most cases, especially if I have Veeam and other solutions with continuous backup and everything else, I have a much higher chance that I'm going to be able to recover the primary database, because that's in most cases what I'm worried about, in a much faster time window. And if that then fails, I can still take my offline backup, which I have on my NFS share. So that's at least the approach which I typically tend to take. And then the offline backups, it really depends, as again, on the use case. I think the last larger provider I did set it up with every 4 hours. But I also made clear, and this is very important for everybody to know, that you need to empty the NFS share then, because it will rapidly grow. Because if you place a new backup there every 4 hours, there is no automatic process which will take old ones away. It will keep as many as you store there. So with that said, open discussion. What are other opinions on how you would back up and what backup method? I mean, does anyone know any other methodology to back up your vCD infrastructure in the first place? A supported one would be great. And what do you see out there? What do people do? What are the strategies? And potentially also, how often do they do these offline backups, if they do these offline backups? So my typical approach is 4 hours, just throwing that one out.
So our official documentation, we have the script that does the Postgres dump, right? And that's really where the brains of the operation are, right? I get a lot of questions on, can I go install this agent in my appliance? Can I do file-based or database back? We frown against that. I just think that you're adding more complexity to it. It's not something, well, just being honest here, it's not something engineering is going to do regression testing for an ecosystem partner that says we're going to go test this, right? And we don't know what the utilization is or any type of conflict, right? I do see VM level backups, right, where they'll try to use the the VADP API and grab a VM level backup on that. But beyond that, that's kind of where I kind of draw the line a little bit. Really, I really focus on ensuring we have at least higher level availability within the database on that. Try to get VM level backups or call some kind of automation workflow, Matthias, to get a Postgres dump on that. And then, I've seen some ecosystem partner backup solutions on that, but it varies. And, quite frankly, I can't, comment further, because typically a provider is going to have a backup strategy already. And, we'll provide guidance and support and say, here's what we do. And, I've seen everything, across the board on that. That's from my purview, what I've seen. So
I typically prefer having a two-way strategy. As you guys mentioned, right? Have the scripts running. Maybe 4 hours is a bit tight schedule, maybe extended to 12 hours, whatever is needed. As Daniel said, it depends, and have an image-based backup on top. I think a two-way strategy is the safest way to go with that for a hopefully successful restore if needed.
And yeah, to test it also. So this is something from the field. I know you should also test your backup, and you should also verify that.
I always thought you test the restore.
But
Sorry.
maybe as we have Romain, and I mean, Toby, you are on the networking side more as well. I mean, vCD backup by itself is nice, but we still, and vCenter is something potentially people can figure out, but ideally we would need to have vCD plus vCenter plus, and now comes the networking part, NSXT also backed up at a similar state, because it doesn't help us if vCD thinks it has a certain edge configuration or a certain switch configuration out there, and the physical infrastructure, or not the physical, but our SDDC infrastructure looks completely different. So any ideas on how to ensure that that kind of is at least in sync?
Tobias, no?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, and yeah, from NSXT, especially from NSXT perspective, and we now should talk about NSXT only, is to do the file level based backup from NSXT. So there is a backup option available inside NSXT. There is a dedicated schedule available inside NSXT, and maybe it makes a lot of sense to have the backup from NSXT running at the same time where the vCD backup is running, so that we have all of the backup files there. And
that would come back to what Daniel said, is having some level of automation or management, ideally in the backend, which at least kind of ensures you will never get them fully in sync, but as long as someone doesn't actually deploy a new VM every 0.7 minutes, and I'm still hoping that Matthias is not shooting for seconds in the future. As long as we have, let's say, more normal service provider environment, and even the larger ones have reasonable change, especially the networking changes are reasonable as long as they are not really on the container side, then it becomes a different story.
Yeah,
I think it's important to have all of these systems in sync and make sure that that also aligns, because I mean, there are a lot of things, and I had the discussion recently on how we could disaster recovery if all of this would fail and we just have ESXi hosts and everything else, where I said it's like, if this is really the scenario we need to prepare for, we should actually more consider having a proper backup of everything else, and not actually run down a discussion on how do we get everything back out of nowhere. Good. Okay, we have already, I think, hit more or less the time window anyway. So before we close, let's do the usual thing again. Everybody can have a closing statement. Let's do the round the other way around. Let's start with Romain. Oh no, it's Toby. Toby was the last one to introduce himself. So
yes, really interesting topics from my side for today. I really learned a lot about what we can do and how we can need to design in Cloud Director environment. So it really was absolutely interesting from my side.
Good, Romain.
Yeah, very interesting. And remember, stretch clusters are not a disaster recovery solution.
Good, Daniel.
Check out the links. I think that we have great insight into performance considerations. Our team did a great job with the scale and performance PDF for 10.2.2. So look at what we've done, right? See what we've done. Don't recreate the wheel. And if you have any questions or any issues, reach out to rdecker@vmware.com. That's who you need to email. R, as in Romain, Decker@vmware.com. Thank you.
At least you didn't put out Raghu's email address. Matthias, closing words?
Yeah, if you're still on the install Cloud Director version, go for the appliance. The migration path is easy, straightforward, well documented, and the appliance is worth shooting or going with it. I love it, especially the database replication mechanism between the primary and the standby appliances.
Wonderful. So that's a good closing statement from that perspective. Yeah, I enjoyed the session today. Again, we are going to do the next recording in a month's time. Hopefully by then, I think still the hope is that we have a new version or something to talk about. Otherwise, we take one of the other topics. If you want to send us any topics, you can. The easiest is just drop us a note in the YouTube channel. If you have any other further questions or anything like that, use the YouTube channel. As said, we will throw this out on YouTube as well as the usual podcast scenarios in the next few days. I mean, you will see this recording then. Don't forget to subscribe to whatever you like the most so that we see what is being most useful. And then it leaves us with saying thank you and see you all again in 1 month's time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.